Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a pretty bold argument about hypothyroidism that comes from Blue Heron Health News. And their entire case kicks off with a claim that really challenges what most of us have been told about the condition.
So right out of the gate, the source material throws down the gauntlet. It's reframing hypothyroidism not as some lifelong sentence that you just have to manage with medication forever, but as something that has a root cause and, they argue, can actually be solved.
To really build their case, they do something pretty smart. They use a story. It's all built around the personal journey of a woman they call Mary Taylor. And her whole experience, from her diagnosis to her frustrations, is really designed to hit home for a lot of people.
And this is where it all starts to feel very real. These aren't just clinical terms on a page. They're the day-in, day-out struggles that the source describes, that constant exhaustion, the weight gain, the emotional toll. It's all meant to be incredibly relatable.
This moment right here is absolutely central to the whole narrative. It really zeroes in on that feeling of frustration. According to the story, Mary's symptoms, the fatigue, the aching, were basically dismissed as just stress. And this sets up a huge theme for the rest of the argument, a critique of a medical system that they claim might not be looking deep enough.
Okay, let's get into the heart of it, because this is the core of the entire argument. The source says there's this massive difference between how hypothyroidism is usually managed and how it could be fixed. And it all comes down to treating the symptoms versus tackling the actual root cause.
So here you can see the two paths laid out side by side. The source describes the conventional way as basically managing the effects of the problem, low T3 and T4 hormones with medication. But this alternative approach asks a totally different question. Why is the thyroid not working right in the first place? And that shifts the focus away from the thyroid and onto the immune system.
So if the problem isn't just the thyroid gland itself, what is it? Well, the source points to a completely different culprit. The argument is that what we call hypothyroidism isn't even the real disease, but just a symptom of a much deeper issue that's happening throughout the body.
And here it is, the source identifies chronic inflammation as the real enemy. Think about it like this. When you get an insect bite, that redness and swelling, that's your immune system doing its job. But chronic inflammation is when that response gets stuck in the on position, never shutting off, and eventually it just gets exhausted.
And this is what happens when that immune system is overworked. According to this text, it starts to make mistakes. It gets confused and misidentifies your own healthy tissue as a threat. We see this in things like rheumatoid arthritis, where it attacks the joints. And in Hashimoto's thyroiditis, the target is your own thyroid cells. It basically becomes an autoimmune problem. All right, so how do we even get to this point? Well, the source presents this whole process as a really clear, logical sequence. They use this fantastic metaphor of a chain of dominoes, where one thing directly knocks over the next, leading straight to that autoimmune attack on the thyroid.
Every chain reaction has to start somewhere, right? The narrative argues that this entire cascade, from a perfectly healthy body to a thyroid that's under attack, starts with one single, pervasive thing in our modern lives.
That first domino, according to the source, is an overload of toxins. The argument is that our bodies are just constantly bombarded with chemicals from our food, our cleaning products, even the air we breathe, way more than our immune systems were ever built to handle. And this forces our immune system to work overtime, 24/7.
This slide just lays out that whole chain of events beautifully. You've got the toxin overload, which leads to an overworked immune system. That creates chronic inflammation. Then, that stressed-out system starts to malfunction, and ultimately, it turns on the body and attacks the thyroid. The symptoms we call hypothyroidism, the source claims, are really just the last domino to fall.
Okay, so if the problem is a chain of falling dominoes, then the solution has to be about setting them back up, right? So let's look at how the source says you can reverse this whole process with an approach that they describe as surprisingly simple.
First things first, the narrative is really quick to address what you might be worried about. It makes it very clear that this solution is not about some crazy restrictive diet or expensive supplements or a total life overhaul. It's positioned as something anyone can do, not some impossible challenge.
So what is it then? Well, it's presented as being all about knowledge and simple swaps. The idea is to just understand where the main toxins are coming from and then swap those items for better alternatives. The source really emphasizes just minor tweaks and this 80-20 rule, which basically says you don't have to be perfect. Small, consistent changes are enough to start tipping those dominoes back up.
This quote is so powerful because of how simple it is. It really captures the entire philosophy here. The problem isn't framed as some rare, exotic disease, but as a side effect of our ordinary, everyday lives.
And because of that, it can be fixed with ordinary, everyday changes.
And to show this isn't about giving up everything you love, the source gives some pretty surprising examples. Coffee? Totally fine. Meat? Go for it. They even include a recipe for hot chocolate. This is all designed to show that this approach is about making smart choices, not being miserable. It even points out that a couple of foods we usually think of as healthy might be ones we want to use a bit more carefully.
And finally, the source doesn't just stop with the solution. It zooms way out to ask a much bigger question about how medical knowledge actually works in the real world. And it leaves us with a pretty provocative idea to chew on.
Now, to back up its claims, this source points out that this whole idea connecting inflammation and disease is not some fringe theory. It notes that scientists have already identified over 100 different immune system disorders, grounding its whole argument in what it presents as well-established science.
So we're left with this final question. The source argues that there's this big delay, a time gap, between what scientific research discovers and what actually becomes standard practice for doctors. It really encourages you to think critically about where health advice comes from. And it makes you wonder, what other connections might be hiding in that gap? And what could that mean for how we approach not just hypothyroidism, but our health in general?